The wagon lurched violently, splintering wheels sending her tumbling into the frozen dirt, bruised and bleeding. The world around her a blur of snow and shadowed trees. Her breaths came ragged, panic clawing at her chest as she realized she had been left for dead. Abandoned to the elements, yet through the storm and isolation, a faint warmth appeared, a stranger's approach, carrying the quiet promise of tenderness that could rewrite the story of her shattered life. The snow was relentless, a blinding curtain of white that swallowed the wagon tracks and blurred the edges of the world. She lay sprawled across the frozen ground, body aching, clothes torn and stained with mud and blood, each breath a sharp, bitter stab in her chest. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself upright, but the cold stole her strength, and the distant groan of the wind mocked her futile efforts. Memories flashed unbidden, the sudden lurch of the wagon, the harsh shouts, the betrayal in familiar faces she had trusted. How quickly loyalty had turned to abandonment, how easily she had been discarded like refuse. Anger flared, but it was fragile, nearly extinguished by the sheer immensity of fear pressing against her chest. Survival was no longer a choice. It was a raw, desperate necessity. A challenge that tested every nerve, every pulse, every fragile thought. Her eyes scanned the desolate landscape, searching for anything, a movement, a shadow, a hint of life that might offer a chance to cling to hope. Trees loomed like silent sentinels, skeletal and forbidding, their branches scraping the gray sky, while the snow beneath them shifted and whispered. Her body shivered uncontrollably, but even through the frost-numbed muscles and burning lungs, a flicker of determination sparked. She would not surrender here, not in this frozen void, not yet. Then she saw him, at first just a dark shape on the horizon, a silhouette moving with quiet purpose against the swirling storm. Heart-hammering, she blinked, unsure if her mind conjured him from desperation. But no, the figure grew closer, deliberate and steady, carrying a presence that seemed almost impossible in such merciless cold. He was a stranger, yet his gaze was not harsh, not judging, only alert, wary and tinged with concern that reached her in a way she had not felt in days. He knelt beside her without hesitation, his hands moving with gentle precision to assess her injuries. His clothing, rugged and layered against the winter, suggested a life lived on the edges of civilization. But there was tenderness in the way he touched her, a patience that contrasted sharply with the harshness she had endured. "You're going to be all right," he murmured, voice low but firm, a promise threaded with an unspoken acknowledgement of the danger still looming around them. She wanted to recoil, to guard herself against trust, but the fatigue and pain made resistance impossible. Her body ached for warmth, her mind ached for kindness, and in the stranger's eyes she glimpsed the possibility of both. Each careful movement he made, adjusting her blanket, checking her pulse, brushing snow from her hair, was a quiet act of care that slowly built a fragile bridge across the canyon of fear and betrayal she had been left to navigate alone. The wind roared louder, flinging snow into her face and biting into her exposed skin. But she held on to his presence, clinging not just to the promise of survival, but to the unexpected seed of trust growing between them. And though she could not yet speak it aloud, a flicker of hope ignited. Perhaps this stranger, this unexpected hand reaching through the storm, could rewrite more than just the immediate battle for life. Perhaps he could help her reclaim a story long abandoned to darkness. But even as relief began to stir, the world outside their fragile cocoon reminded her that danger had not passed. The forest was silent in its threat, the snow concealing hidden peril. And the question lingered in her chest. Could she allow herself to depend on another? Or would the fear of betrayal once again leave her exposed, alone and vulnerable to the merciless wilderness? The stranger worked methodically, his hands steady even as the wind tore at their small sanctuary. He ripped strips from his scarf to bind the shallow cuts on her arms, murmuring instructions in a low, calm tone that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding them. She flinched with every movement, the trauma of betrayal still raw, yet she could not deny the warmth spreading from his touch, an anchor against the storm battering her body and mind. "Lean on me," he said quietly, helping her to sit upright. "I've got you." There was no question in his voice, no hesitation, only certainty, and for the first time since the wagon had tipped, she felt a flicker of safety. Her lips parted to speak, to ask his name, to demand answers, but the words died in her throat. Vulnerability felt dangerous, but she sensed that his presence was a rare gift, one she could not afford to dismiss. They moved slowly through the snow-laden forest, her trembling steps guided by his firm grip. The cold bit through her wool coat, but the stranger seemed impervious to the wind, a living shield against the merciless elements. Each step was precarious, the snow hiding treacherous roots and icy patches, yet he moved with deliberate precision, his eyes scanning constantly for hidden threats. She realized with awe that survival was not merely about strength. It was about foresight, patience, and the courage to act when others might hesitate. Her mind wandered to the wagon, abandoned and shattered, and the bitter knowledge that she had been left for dead. Anger surfaced again, but it was tempered by exhaustion and the stranger's calm authority. He had arrived when she had been most alone, defying the cruelty of circumstance with the quiet power of compassion. She had always believed survival demanded solitude. Now she began to understand that it might require connection. Fragile though it was, hours passed in a rhythm of careful movement and intermittent rest. They paused beside a frozen stream, the stranger kneeling to scoop up snow, melting it over a small flame in a metal cup. He offered it to her without words, and she drank gratefully, the warmth trickling through her chest and fingers alike. In that moment, she realized how much of her fear had been born from isolation, and how the smallest gestures, shared water, steady hands, protective presence, could rewrite the story she had thought ended. The forest around them was silent but alive with hidden dangers. Branches groaned under heavy snow, shadows shifted unpredictably, and every gust of wind carried the threat of a new hazard. Yet despite the constant peril, her trust grew in tandem with her reliance on him. Each cautious step forward, each shared glance, each quiet act of care built a fragile bridge between two people marked by past pain, a bridge that might allow them both to survive not only the wilderness, but the lingering scars of human betrayal. By the time twilight settled over the forest, casting long, wavering shadows, she could feel her own heartbeat slowing, the adrenaline ebbing but leaving her more aware of the stranger beside her. He glanced at her, a faint smile brushing his lips, and she understood that the journey was far from over. But for the first time, she believed she might endure it. Not alone, not abandoned, but with someone whose tenderness could teach her that even in the harshest cold, life and trust might bloom again. Yet beneath the fragile hope, a question lingered, sharp and unrelenting. Could she let herself truly depend on him, or would the shadows of betrayal return to shatter the fragile bond they had begun to forge? The answer remained uncertain, and the forest, silent and relentless, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Dawn broke slowly, pale light filtering through the dense branches, casting jagged shadows over the snow-laden forest. The cold had not relented, but the stranger's presence had become a steady rhythm in her life, a tether that kept her from succumbing to despair. Yet even as she felt the fragile comfort of companionship, the forest reminded her that survival was never assured. Every step could hide danger. Every sound could signal disaster. He moved ahead of her, breaking trail with methodical precision, his worn leather boots crunching against ice and frost. She followed, shivering, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Her injuries had been tended, but fatigue lingered in every muscle, every joint. Despite the warmth he offered in subtle ways, steadying hands, brief glances of reassurance, she felt the weight of vulnerability pressing down. She was learning to trust, but the question lingered. Could trust survive in a world that had proven so cruel? They came upon a clearing, the forest opening to reveal jagged rocks and a frozen creek. Snow clung to the bare branches, glittering like fractured glass in the dim light. The stranger paused, scanning the area with sharp, measured movements, his eyes alert for predators or hidden hazards. She watched him, the tension in his shoulders betraying the burden he bore silently. Even those who seemed strongest carried unseen weight, she realized. And perhaps it was the very act of survival that forced one to confront both the world and the self. "You need to rest," he said finally, voice quiet, deliberate, carrying authority without demand. He gestured toward a cluster of rocks that could serve as a makeshift shelter from the wind. She hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion, but the ache in her limbs and the frost burning her skin left her little choice. Reluctantly, she sank to the cold ground, wrapping her arms around her knees. He knelt beside her, producing a small bundle of supplies, dried meat, a bit of bread, and a tin cup of snow-melted water. The act was simple, but to her it felt monumental, a reminder that compassion could exist even in the harshest wilderness. She accepted the food, eating slowly, mind racing with thoughts of betrayal, abandonment, and now, this fragile glimmer of care as she ate. He spoke of survival, not just the practicalities of the forest, but the mindset required to endure. "You can't only rely on yourself," he said gently, eyes fixed on the horizon. "The world doesn't forgive weakness, but neither does it reward solitude. Trust patience, knowing when to act. That's how you survive." She listened intently, absorbing not only his words, but the weight behind them, the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had navigated life's harshest tests and endured. Her mind wandered, circling the memories of the wagon, the cold betrayal, the gnawing sense of abandonment. Anger and fear still churned beneath her ribs, yet a new awareness began to take root. Survival was no longer merely enduring the elements. It was learning to lean on another, to forge a bond that could withstand not just snow and ice, but the lingering scars of humanity's cruelty. The wind howled through the trees, rattling branches and stirring snow into ghostly swirls. She looked at the stranger beside her and felt a curious mixture of vulnerability and resolve. The world had been cruel, but perhaps in his steadfast presence, there was a chance to reclaim not only her life, but her heart. Yet even in that quiet moment of fragile connection, a shadow of doubt persisted. Could she allow herself to rely on someone so completely? Or would history repeat itself, leaving her exposed once more in the unforgiving wilderness? The answer was uncertain, and the forest, vast and silent, seemed to hold its breath, awaiting her next move. The forest seemed alive with quiet menace, every shadow a possible threat, every crack of ice a warning. She moved cautiously, the stranger's presence at her side a steady reassurance, yet her mind refused to let go of the lingering fear that had defined her since the wagon overturned. The snow beneath her boots was deceptive, sometimes soft and yielding, other times brittle and treacherous, threatening to give way and plunge her into frozen despair. He paused, turning to study her face, eyes sharp but patient. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly. And she wanted to believe him, desperately wanted to, but the memory of betrayal weighed heavily. Could strength truly exist alongside vulnerability? Could trust endure when the past had proven so unyielding? They reached a narrow gorge, the frozen creek below churning faintly beneath sheets of ice. A fallen tree formed a precarious bridge across the gap, slick with frost and snow. Her stomach knotted as she stared down at the drop, panic clawing at her chest. He stepped forward, steady, placing a hand near hers. "I'll guide you," he said simply, voice calm against the roar of her fear. Step by trembling step they crossed, the tree creaking under their weight, snow flaking off branches above. Her hands clutched his arm instinctively, a lifeline in both the literal and emotional sense. She realized that survival had become more than avoiding injury. It was learning to accept help, to let another's strength support her own, to allow herself to be seen without fear. Once across, she sank to her knees, panting, chest heaving, tears stinging her frozen eyes. He knelt beside her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "It's okay," he murmured. "You made it." The words were simple, but they carried a weight heavier than any snowstorm or forest peril. Acknowledgement, acceptance, and a rare, gentle affirmation that she mattered. As they continued through the forest, the wind eased slightly, the day growing dim with late afternoon light. Snowflakes drifted lazily around them, each one catching the fading sun like fragile promises suspended in air. She stole glances at him, noting the stoic set of his jaw, the faint lines etched by years of hardship, and the quiet determination in his eyes. He was a stranger, yes, but in that moment, he was also a guide, a protector, a bridge between her past of abandonment and the fragile hope of something new. Suddenly, The sound of cracking branches echoed through the clearing, sharp and sudden. Both froze, muscles taut, instincts flaring. The forest held its breath with them, suspense coiling tight as shadows shifted. Was it an animal, another threat from humanity, or merely the wind playing tricks? The question left them on edge, hearts pounding in unison, aware that survival demanded vigilance at every moment. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable but firm, and she understood without words. They would face it together. Whether the danger was real or imagined, the lesson was clear. Trust and unity were now as vital as courage or skill. Her pulse still raced, but she allowed herself a flicker of gratitude. Fragile though it was for this unexpected partnership, this shared endurance that had become their lifeline. And yet, beneath that bond, a lingering fear remained. Could she truly rely on him when the world had already proven so untrustworthy? The answer was not yet clear, and the forest, vast and indifferent, seemed to wait with bated breath, holding the next trial, the next test. Just beyond the frozen horizon, the forest began to thin, the tall pines giving way to jagged rocks and exposed ridges. The wind had sharpened overnight, carrying an icy bite that cut through their layered clothing and gnawed at every inch of exposed skin. She pulled her coat tighter, but even the thick fabric could not guard against the relentless cold. Each breath came in white plumes, harsh and ragged, and she felt the familiar tremor of fatigue crawling up her legs and arms. He moved with steady confidence, scanning the horizon as they climbed, his eyes never leaving the terrain. She followed his lead, limbs aching, but an unspoken urgency drove her forward. Survival was no longer simply about enduring the storm. It was about navigating the treacherous edge of the ridge, where one misstep could mean disaster. And beyond that, she realized survival was about learning to trust, not just in him, but in herself. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the crunch of snow underfoot and the distant howl of the wind through jagged rocks. Her mind replayed the moments leading to the wagon's betrayal, the searing anger and despair that had threatened to drown her in the snow. Yet here, beside a stranger whose presence radiated both strength and tenderness, she felt a fragile sense of recalibration, an understanding that endurance alone could no longer define her. She needed guidance, she needed connection. Suddenly, a loose stone shifted underfoot, sliding toward the cliff's edge with a sharp scrape that echoed like a warning. Her heart leapt, and instinctively she reached for him. His hand closed over hers, firm and unwavering. "Careful," he said, voice low but commanding. One step at a time. She felt the pulse of trust in that simple gesture, a tether anchoring her to something steady in the chaos of the world around them. As they continued, the ridge narrowed, the snow turning to ice beneath their boots. She faltered, legs trembling, and he instinctively steadied her, his hands brushing her arms with a tenderness that sent a shiver through her, not entirely from cold. The storm had tested her body and will, but now it tested her ability to surrender, to lean on someone else, to allow herself to feel safety and warmth in the presence of another. A distant cry broke through the wind, sharp and human, carrying urgency that made her blood run cold. They froze, ears straining. It could have been an animal, or worse, a person with intentions as cold as the mountain itself. His eyes narrowed, scanning the slopes, and she felt a thrill of fear and adrenaline ripple through her veins. Survival was immediate, tangible. One wrong move could undo everything they had endured. He gestured for her to crouch behind a boulder, a shield against both wind and unseen threat. Her heart pounded, and she realized she had come to rely on his instincts, on his guidance more than she had ever relied on herself. And yet, in that moment of peril, she also recognized her own growing courage, the willingness to follow, to act, to face danger rather than shrink from it. Time stretched, the wind screaming around them, snow whipping into their faces. Every moment heightened her awareness, every movement a test of nerve and trust. And as she looked at the stranger beside her, stoic but alert, she understood that this journey was more than survival. It was about redefining what it meant to endure, to connect, and to reclaim the strength she had thought lost forever. Yet even as adrenaline surged and hope flickered, the mountain whispered its warning. The ridge ahead was narrower, the storm unrelenting, and the next step could demand a choice that would alter everything. Could they survive not only the treacherous path, but the unspoken fears and unhealed scars that clung to them both? The answer remained shrouded in snow and shadow. The ridge narrowed further, sheer cliffs rising on either side, the wind slicing through every layer of clothing and biting at their exposed skin. Her legs shook violently with fatigue, muscles screaming in protest, yet she pressed forward, guided by the stranger's steady presence. Each step demanded focus, each breath felt stolen by the frozen air, and every glance downward reminded her how precarious survival had become. A jagged gust slammed into her, almost knocking her off balance. She froze, heart hammering, white-knuckled fingers gripping the stranger's arm. His eyes met hers, calm and unwavering, and he murmured, "You've got this. Trust yourself. And trust me." The words, simple yet profound, grounded her, anchoring her in the moment and giving her the courage to continue. Survival was no longer about brute strength alone. It was about faith in guidance and the fragile bond they had begun to forge. Suddenly, the wind carried another sound, a sharp, metallic snap from above. A rock had dislodged, hurtling down the slope toward them. She screamed, instinctively throwing herself behind a boulder, the stranger shielding her with his own body. The impact rattled the ground beneath them, and snow cascaded from the cliffs like a frozen waterfall. Adrenaline surged through her veins, mingling with fear, relief, and a strange, nascent exhilaration. When the debris settled, she peered out cautiously. He was still beside her, unscathed, eyes dark with concern and a trace of something she could not name. Admiration, perhaps, or relief. Her chest heaved, body trembling not just from cold, but from the intensity of surviving another deadly moment. She realized then that fear and trust could coexist, that vulnerability was not weakness, and that even in moments of near destruction, connection could blossom. They continued along the ridge, each step a delicate negotiation with gravity and icy terrain. She began to notice how he moved with careful precision, his boots finding holds where she saw none, his hands steady, his gaze constantly scanning the slopes. He was a master of the mountain, yes, but more than that. He had become a guide in the labyrinth of her own fragile heart, teaching her that courage was not absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. Hours passed. The storm intensified briefly, snow whipping against them in violent sheets, and she clung to him instinctively, leaning on the warmth of his body for both protection and reassurance. They reached a small plateau, a temporary haven from the relentless climb. She sank to the cold ground, chest heaving, eyes meeting his. No words were necessary. The intensity of what they had endured, physical danger, emotional upheaval, and the slow, tentative trust forming between them, hung thick in the air. Yet even in that fragile moment of relief, she could not ignore the questions stirring in her chest. Could she truly rely on another? Could she allow herself to feel hope when betrayal had once defined her world? And as she looked into his eyes, she saw mirrored doubts, scars she could not yet name. The mountain had tested them physically, but the deeper trial was emotional, learning to depend on each other, to allow trust to exist where fear had long reigned. The plateau offered a fleeting pause, but the horizon hinted at more challenges ahead. Steeper cliffs, deeper snow, and hidden dangers that neither had yet imagined. The question lingered, unspoken but urgent. Would they survive the next trial, and would the fragile connection they had forged endure the storm yet to come? The mountain waited, silent and indifferent, holding its breath for the answer. The wind had grown sharper, slicing through their clothing like jagged blades, carrying snow in torrents that stung exposed skin and made every step an ordeal. The plateau they had reached offered only a brief respite. Ahead, jagged cliffs rose like silent sentinels, daring them to continue. She rubbed her arms, shivering uncontrollably, and realized that survival was no longer just physical. It demanded endurance of the mind, heart, and will. He moved beside her, his presence both protective and unwavering. The ridge ahead was treacherous, covered in fresh, loose snow that threatened to give way beneath each step. She faltered, vision blurred with exhaustion, and he steadied her, his hand firm on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured, voice carrying through the howl of the wind. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the warmth of certainty, but the past, the betrayal of those she had once trusted, clung to her like a shadow. They pressed onward, the cold biting deeper with every step. The snow beneath them groaned and cracked ominously, and she realized how thin the line between survival and catastrophe truly was. Her thoughts flickered to the wagon, the scene of her abandonment, and a flash of anger surged through her, but the stranger's steady gaze reminded her that she could not allow bitterness to paralyze her. Survival required trust, not resentment, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. Suddenly, a harsh gust tore through the ridge, sending snow flurries into their faces. She stumbled, slipping perilously close to the edge. Instinctively, he grabbed her, his arms wrapping around her as he pulled her back to safety. Her heart pounded, fear mingling with a rising awareness. She was no longer alone, and yet reliance carried its own danger. Could she fully trust him, or was she merely clinging to a temporary lifeline? They paused behind a jagged rock, panting, eyes scanning the shifting horizon. She could feel the tension coiling within her, part fear, part relief, part something unnameable. He produced a small flask from his pack, offering it silently. She took it, the warmth of the liquid spreading through her, grounding her trembling body. Each act of care, no matter how small, seemed monumental in a world that had stripped her of everything. As they continued, she noticed his hands, weathered and scarred, moving with care over the terrain, adjusting grips, shifting weight to stabilize both of them. There was an intimacy in his movements, a wordless communication that said, "I will not let you fall." She felt the stirrings of connection, fragile trust beginning to weave its way through the fear, and for the first time in days, the thought of hope flickered in her mind. The ridge narrowed sharply, forcing them to move in single file. Her pulse raced with every step, her body trembling under the weight of cold and exhaustion. Yet with each movement, she felt herself growing, not just physically stronger, but emotionally resilient. The stranger's presence had become a mirror, reflecting courage she had long forgotten she possessed. Then, without warning, a distant roar shattered the stillness. A landslide, snow and rock cascading down a slope to their left. Instinct surged through her, adrenaline mixing with terror. They froze, hearts hammering, eyes wide, every muscle poised to react. The forest and cliffs around them seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. The danger was immediate, and the choice undeniable: move forward with courage or risk being swallowed by the mountain. And in that suspended moment, she realized survival was no longer about solitude. It was about trust, action, and the willingness to face fear alongside someone who had become more than a stranger. The landslide roared down the slope, a thunderous avalanche of snow and rock that rattled the ridge beneath their boots. She clutched the stranger's arm instinctively, fear and adrenaline mingling in a dizzying pulse. Each second stretched, heartbeats hammering as they waited for the immediate danger to pass. He held her close, body tense but controlled, his eyes scanning the shifting terrain with a focus born of experience. When the roar finally subsided, a trail of debris scarred the mountainside, and she exhaled shakily, a mix of relief and lingering terror washing over her. He turned to her, hand brushing a strand of hair from her frost-stung face, and in that small gesture she felt an anchor, a tether to life and safety in a world that had so recently tried to take both. "We need to move," he said, voice steady, a reminder that even after surviving near catastrophe, the mountain demanded vigilance. She nodded, swallowing the lump of fear lodged in her throat. Each step forward required trust not only in him, but in herself, a fragile courage forged in fire and ice. The path grew steeper, jagged rocks protruding through snowdrifts, forcing them to climb in careful, deliberate motions. Every movement demanded balance, strength, and attention, and the strain pressed down on her like a physical weight. Yet she felt herself changing, adapting, learning not just to endure but to anticipate, to act, to survive. The stranger's presence had become a guide, not just for the path, but for her own trembling, uncertain heart. A sudden gust tore through the ridge, nearly toppling her. He reacted instantly, grabbing her wrist, anchoring her to the solid ground, their breaths mingling in the icy air. In that heartbeat, she felt a swell of gratitude, a mixture of fear, relief, and a trust that had begun to root itself deep within her. Survival was no longer a solitary struggle. It had become a shared endeavor, an unspoken partnership forged in adversity. They reached a narrow ledge, snow piled precariously at the edge. The world seemed to hold its breath around them, frozen in white silence except for the sharp hiss of wind. She glanced at him, eyes wide, and he offered a faint, reassuring nod. Step by cautious step they advanced, every footfall a testament to resilience, every grasp a silent promise of support. Finally, they reached a small outcropping, a natural refuge where the snow had been partially shielded from the storm. She collapsed onto the icy ground, muscles trembling, lungs burning, yet inside her chest, something shifted, a fragile ember of hope, a recognition that she had endured far more than she had believed possible. He crouched beside her, eyes scanning the horizon as if to challenge the mountain itself. Yet his presence was steady, grounding her even as her mind raced with lingering fears. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider what lay beyond survival: connection, trust, even the possibility of care without betrayal. She met his gaze, and in the depths of his eyes she saw a reflection of something she had thought lost forever: humanity, patience, tenderness. Yet beneath that fragile hope, the mountain whispered its warning. The path ahead remained treacherous, and the choices they made next would test not only their bodies, but their hearts. And so they paused, side by side, breathing in the cold, white silence, each aware that the journey was far from over. Could she truly rely on him? Could she allow herself to hope? The answers remained hidden, suspended in the frozen air. As the mountain waited, indifferent, for the next trial, the snow began to lighten, turning from blinding white to a soft, powdery gray, as the first hints of morning sunlight broke through heavy clouds. The wind had eased, though the chill remained, and the mountain no longer felt as hostile, though danger still lingered in the creaking cliffs and jagged ledges. She moved beside him, muscles still trembling, yet each step carried a newfound confidence, a fragile courage tempered by weeks of survival and trust forged in adversity. The stranger's gaze never wavered, scanning the path ahead, alert to every hidden risk. His hands occasionally brushed against hers, a simple gesture of support, yet each touch carried the weight of unspoken reassurance. She realized, with a mixture of awe and relief, that the bond between them had deepened far beyond mere survival. It was trust, raw and fragile, yet undeniable, a lifeline woven through shared fear, pain, and perseverance. They reached a rocky overhang that offered a brief reprieve from the cold wind. She sank to the ground, brushing snow from her hair and clothing, muscles screaming from exertion. He crouched beside her, eyes reflecting both concern and admiration. "You've come a long way," he said quietly, voice carrying over the muted whisper of shifting snow. She wanted to smile, wanted to speak, but exhaustion and emotion clogged her throat. The words that mattered could not be spoken yet. They lived in glances, in small gestures, in the rhythm of shared survival. Her mind drifted to the wagon, the betrayal, the isolation she had endured. A wave of grief surged, sharp and piercing, but it was tempered now by gratitude and the flicker of hope she had long thought extinguished. She realized that survival had not only been physical, it had been emotional, a test of resilience and trust, courage, and the ability to lean on another without fear. And in this stranger, this guide who had become a companion in the harshest of worlds, she glimpsed the possibility of something more. The path ahead narrowed into a steep descent, cliffs on either side framing the treacherous trail. She swallowed, gripping her pack and bracing herself. He moved first, carefully demonstrating each foothold and crevice, and she followed, mimicking his movements, each step a lesson in courage and precision. Her body still ached, but determination pushed her forward. Every stumble became a moment of learning, every pause a chance to recalibrate. A sudden gust of wind shook loose a layer of snow above, sending a cascade sliding toward them. Instinctively, he shielded her with his body, a reflexive act that left her breathless. She felt a surge of emotions, fear, gratitude, awe, and realized that their connection had become more than necessity. It was now intertwined with something deeper: reliance, trust, and an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability. They reached a small plateau, the snow thinner here, revealing patches of rock warmed faintly by the weak sunlight. She sank to the ground again, chest heaving, eyes meeting his. There was no need for words. The shared understanding between them spoke volumes. They had endured, they had survived, and something had shifted within her heart. The mountain had tested them, yes, but it had also revealed the power of trust, compassion, and the fragile resilience of human connection. Yet even in this brief haven, uncertainty lingered. Could she truly embrace the trust that had grown, or would fear of betrayal continue to shadow her steps? The answer remained suspended in the cold, pale light as the mountain waited, silent and indifferent, for the choices that with the sun broke fully over the ridge, casting a pale golden light that reflected off the snow in shimmering brilliance. The mountain, once a merciless adversary, now seemed to breathe with them, the storm behind them and the path ahead finally visible. She looked at the stranger, his eyes scanning the horizon. Every line of his face softened by the morning glow, and for the first time, she felt the possibility of a future beyond fear and survival. Their descent continued with careful precision, but the urgency had lessened. Each step forward was no longer driven solely by the need to survive, but by a tentative desire to embrace what awaited beyond the harsh terrain. She realized that survival was not merely enduring storms or navigating treacherous cliffs. It was also about confronting the remnants of pain, betrayal, and isolation that had once defined her. And in this shared journey, she had discovered the strength to face not only the mountain, but herself. They reached a narrow ledge overlooking a valley blanketed in snow. The vast expanse below shimmered under the morning sun, untouched and pure, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past days. She breathed deeply, letting the crisp air fill her lungs, feeling a serenity that had been foreign for so long. The stranger placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, steadying her, and she met his gaze. In that look, unspoken words passed between them, gratitude, trust, and a fragile acknowledgement of the bond forged through hardship. For a moment, silence enveloped them, broken only by the distant echo of shifting snow. She realized how far she had come, from abandoned and broken in a wagon, to standing atop a mountain, alive, unbroken, and capable of feeling hope. The stranger had not only guided her physically through the wilderness, but emotionally through the jagged terrain of her own heart. He had shown her that tenderness could coexist with strength, and that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions. The descent continued, and with each careful step, she felt fear loosen its grip. The mountain's peril remained, but so did the presence of someone steadfast, someone who had become a companion, a protector, and perhaps the first true human connection she had allowed herself since betrayal had scarred her. She felt a courage deeper than survival, the courage to trust, to rely, and to open herself to the fragile warmth of compassion. As they finally reached the lower slopes, where the forest gave way to open land, she turned to the stranger. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with a mixture of exhaustion and newfound resolve. "Thank you for not letting me fall." He gave a small, solemn nod, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "You never fell," he said. "Not really. You just needed someone to help you remember how to stand." The words lingered, echoing through her chest like a melody she had almost forgotten. She realized that the journey had been more than survival. It had been a reclamation of herself, a rewriting of the story she had once believed ended. The mountain had tested them, but it had also revealed the resilience of the human heart, the power of trust, and the possibility of connection even after deep betrayal. As they moved together toward the valley, the sun casting long golden shadows across the snow, she felt the first true flicker of hope in weeks. The future remained uncertain, and the world beyond the mountain would bring new challenges. But she knew one thing with certainty: she would not face them alone. The stranger's tenderness had rewritten her story, transforming despair into resilience, fear into trust, and abandonment into the possibility of love. And in that moment, with the mountain behind them and the unknown ahead, she understood the profound truth that survival was never just about enduring. It was about daring to hope, to trust, and to embrace life fully, even when it demanded every ounce of courage she possessed. would define the rest of their journey, would define the rest of their journey.